My hands went numb when I saw Richard's name on the pension disbursement list, my wife's father receiving monthly payments from the company he swore I'd never lead, the company I'd built from nothing while he mocked every decision I made. That morning in my office, 68 years old and sitting in the CEO chair Richard said I'd never deserve, I was reviewing our quarterly financial reports when my CFO Sandra brought in the routine pension payments documentation for my signature. Most months I barely glanced at these lists, just hundreds of names of retired employees and executives who'd earned their benefits through years of service. But something made me pause on page 7, made my eyes catch on a name that sent ice through my veins despite the warm coffee in my hand. Richard Montgomery, retired senior vice president, monthly pension $3,200, automatic deposit on the 15th of every month for the past 6 years. My father-in-law, the man who'd told me on my wedding day that I lacked ambition and intelligence, who'd said I'd peaked as a regional manager and would spend my career in middle management mediocrity, who'd made it clear that his daughter Margaret deserved better than a nobody from a working-class family with no connections and no prospects. That man was cashing checks from my company, living comfortably on benefits I'd approved, probably never realizing the irony because he'd stopped speaking. To me, decades ago, the family betrayal wasn't loud or dramatic, wasn't the kind of thing you could point to and say, this is where it broke. It was more like water wearing down stone, decades of small dismissals and casual cruelties that accumulated until the relationship was just gone, eroded away by contempt disguised as concern. Richard had made his opinion of me clear from the moment Margaret brought me home to meet her parents 45 years ago. This quiet judgment that radiated from him like heat from pavement in August. The way he'd ask about my job with this patronizing smile that said he already knew I wasn't good enough for his daughter, wasn't impressive enough for his standards, wasn't the son-in-law he'd imagined when he thought about his precious only child's future. I remember that first dinner at their house in the suburbs, the kind of house with white columns and a circular driveway, and furniture that looked expensive because it was, everything carefully arranged to communicate success and status and belonging to a class I'd never been part of. Richard was a senior executive at Donovan Industries back then, one of those men who wore their corporate title like armor, who introduced themselves with their job description before their name, who measured other people's worth by where they worked and how much they earned. Margaret's mother, Eleanor, was quieter but equally judgmental, asking pointed questions about my family background and education with this fake sweetness that couldn't hide the calculation behind her eyes, the assessment of whether I was suitable breeding stock for their grandchildren or just a temporary mistake their daughter would outgrow. I was 23 then, working as an assistant manager at a mid-sized logistics company, making decent money but nothing impressive by Richard's standards, and I could see him writing me off in real time, dismissing me as unworthy before I'd even finished explaining what I did for a living. The dinner was torture, 2 hours of barely concealed contempt wrapped in polite conversation. And afterward in the car, Margaret cried and apologized and said her father would come around once he got to know me better, once he saw how hard I worked and how much I loved her. I believed her because I was young and in love and stupid enough to think that persistence and character would eventually overcome prejudice and snobbery, that Richard would see past his assumptions and recognize my potential. I was wrong about that. Wrong for 45 years. But the story of how I proved him wrong professionally while losing him personally, that's the complicated truth I'm still processing even now as an old man with more regrets than victories. Margaret and I got married anyway, despite her father's obvious disapproval, despite his suggestion that we wait a few more years until I was more established, despite his offer to set me up with job interviews at companies where he had connections, companies where I'd be starting over in entry-level positions, but with the Richard Montgomery seal of approval. I declined those offers, told him respectfully that I appreciated his concern, but I wanted to build my career on my own merit, and I could see the contempt flash across his face, this confirmation of his belief that I was too proud and too stupid to accept help from my betters. The wedding was small, paid for mostly by my parents, who couldn't really afford it, but insisted anyway, because that's what you did. You sacrificed for your children's happiness, even when it hurt. And Richard gave a toast that was technically supportive, but actually dismissive, wishing us luck because we'd clearly need it, hoping I'd mature into the kind of man his daughter deserved, even though he had his doubts. Those early years were hard, not just financially but emotionally, trying to build a life together while knowing Margaret's father thought I was a mistake, knowing every time we visited her parents I was being evaluated and found wanting, knowing that family gatherings were just opportunities for Richard to make subtle comments about my career stagnation and lack of ambition. He'd ask how work was going, in this tone that assumed nothing interesting had happened since we last spoke, would talk about his own successes and promotions with this false modesty that was really just bragging, would offer unsolicited advice about networking and corporate strategy like I was a child who needed basic concepts explained slowly. But I kept working, kept pushing, kept taking on responsibilities, and learning everything I could about logistics and supply chain management and business operations, and slowly, gradually, without drama or attention, I started moving up. Assistant manager became manager, manager became director, director became regional vice president. Each promotion earned through late nights and solved problems and innovations that saved the company money or opened new markets. Margaret was proud of me, believed in me, and that belief mattered more than her father's contempt, or at least, that's what I told myself during the years when family dinners felt like depositions and holidays felt like endurance tests. Richard never acknowledged my success, never congratulated a promotion, or admitted he might have misjudged me, just moved the goalposts every time I achieved something he'd previously said was beyond my capabilities. When I made regional VP, he said that was nice, but real power existed at the corporate level. When I made corporate VP, he said executive leadership was a different game entirely. When I made senior vice president, he said the CEO role required political skills I'd never demonstrated. It was exhausting, this constant invalidation, and Margaret would get angry at her father, would defend me, and argue with him, and eventually reduce our contact with her parents to obligatory holidays and birthday visits, trying to protect our marriage from the poison of her father's ongoing disapproval. But little did I know that Richard's contempt would become the fuel for my greatest professional achievement, the motivation that kept me working when easier paths were available. The real turning point came when I was 43, 20 years into my career, solidly established as a senior vice president, but increasingly frustrated with the limitations of working for someone else, answering to boards and investors and executives who didn't share my vision for how logistics could be revolutionized through technology and relationship-based customer service. I'd been developing ideas for years, sketches and business plans and market analyses that I worked on in my spare time, and Margaret encouraged me to take the leap, to start my own company, to bet on myself the way her father never had. The risk was enormous. We'd have to mortgage our house, drain our savings, probably go into debt for years while the business got established, and we had 2 kids in middle school who'd need college tuition in a few years. But Margaret said she believed in me, said we'd make it work, said her father's opinion didn't matter because I'd already proven myself in ways he was too blind to recognize. So I did it. Resigned from my comfortable executive position with its 6-figure salary and generous benefits, started Translogic Solutions in our basement with 2 employees and a dream of building something better than what existed, something focused on innovation and integrity and treating both workers and clients with unprecedented respect. Richard thought I'd lost my mind, told Margaret privately that I was having a midlife crisis, that I'd thrown away a secure career for a fantasy that would bankrupt our family, that she should consider whether she wanted to go down with my sinking ship or protect herself and the kids by getting out while there was still something to salvage. Margaret told me about that conversation, crying with anger and hurt, and I held her and promised that her father would eat those words someday, that I'd build something so successful he couldn't ignore it, couldn't dismiss it, couldn't pretend I was still the unimpressive nobody he judged me as on that first dinner 45 years ago. The first 5 years were brutal, exactly as hard as Richard predicted, but for different reasons, not because my ideas were bad, but because execution is always harder than vision, because building a business from scratch means learning 1,000 lessons the expensive way, because competition is fierce and capital is scarce, and making payroll sometimes means not taking a salary yourself for months at a time. We lived lean, canceled vacations, drove old cars, told the kids they'd need scholarships and student loans because we couldn't afford to fully fund their education, And through it all, Richard's predictions echoed in my head like a curse, the voice saying I'd fail, I'd always fail, because I wasn't smart enough, or connected enough, or ambitious enough to play in the big leagues. But Translogix survived, then thrived, growing slowly but steadily through word-of-mouth recommendations and genuine innovation in how we handled supply chain optimization, how we treated employees like assets rather than expenses, how we built long-term partnerships with clients rather than just chasing transactional revenue. By year 7, we had 50 employees. By year 10, we had 200. By year 15, we were one of the fastest-growing logistics companies in the region. And I'd gone from working in my basement to leading an organization that was attracting attention from industry analysts and competitors who wanted to copy our model or acquire us outright. Richard never commented on this success, never acknowledged that maybe he'd been wrong about my potential, just stopped asking about work entirely, stopped offering his patronizing advice, stopped attending family gatherings where he might have to face the evidence of my achievements. Margaret's mother, Eleanor, would mention occasionally that Richard had read about Translogix in the business section, that he'd seen our revenue reports or acquisition offers, but she never said he was proud or impressed, just that he'd noticed, and that lukewarm acknowledgement felt more insulting than his previous active contempt. The relationship between Richard and me became purely formal, showing up at the same family events but barely speaking, exchanging pleasantries about weather and grandchildren but avoiding any real conversation, existing in parallel universes where I was building a business empire and he was coasting toward retirement on his corporate pension, both of us pretending the other didn't represent everything we'd fought against in our own ways. Margaret maintained her relationship with her parents, took the kids to visit them, tried to bridge the gap, but she stopped expecting me to be part of that bridge, accepted that her father and her husband would never have the relationship she'd hoped for when we first got married. Then something happened that I didn't learn about until years later, something that would eventually connect Richard to my company in a way neither of us could have predicted. Donovan Industries, the corporation where Richard had spent his entire career, where he'd climbed the ladder and earned his executive title and built his identity as a successful businessman, was acquired by a private equity firm that immediately started gutting middle management and consolidating operations. Richard was 62, 3 years from his planned retirement, and he got caught in the restructuring, forced into early retirement with a reduced pension and severance package that was technically legal but morally questionable, the kind of thing that happens to thousands of executives every year but feels personal when it happens to you. Margaret told me about it over dinner one night, said her father was devastated, that his whole identity had been wrapped up in his corporate title, and now he was adrift, forced out before he was ready, watching younger executives take over his responsibilities while he went from important to irrelevant overnight. I felt sympathy for him despite our history, understood that losing your career identity is painful regardless of how successful you'd been, but I also felt a dark satisfaction, a sense that maybe the universe had delivered its own commentary on Richard's arrogance, his belief that corporate titles equated to personal worth, his dismissal of people like me who built things rather than just managing them. What I didn't know then, wouldn't find out until much later, was that Richard's reduced pension wasn't enough to maintain the lifestyle he and Eleanor had built over 40 years of executive salary, wasn't enough to cover their mortgage and country club dues and the expensive habits they'd developed when money seemed unlimited. Richard was too proud to ask for help, too ashamed to admit he'd been pushed out rather than retiring on his own terms, too invested in maintaining appearances to let anyone know he was struggling financially. So he did what he'd always done. He networked, he called in favors, he leveraged his remaining connections to find opportunities that could supplement his inadequate pension. One of those connections was with a former colleague named Patterson, who'd left Donovan Industries years earlier and was now a senior executive at Translogix, my company, hired during our rapid expansion phase when we were recruiting experienced leaders who could help us scale without losing our culture. Patterson mentioned to Richard that Translogix was looking for consultants, executives with deep industry experience who could work part-time helping with strategic planning and client relationships, and would Richard be interested in applying? Richard jumped at it, needed the income and probably thought it would be easy money, consulting work that would let him feel important again without the stress of full-time employment. The application came through HR, crossed my desk as part of the routine approval process for senior consultant positions, and I remember staring at Richard Montgomery's resume, seeing his credentials and his Donovan Industries pedigree and his extensive experience, and feeling this complicated mixture of emotions I couldn't untangle. Part of me wanted to reject it outright, to return the same dismissal he'd given me for decades, to prove that I could control his professional fate the way he'd once tried to control mine. Part of me wanted to hire him just to make him report to people who reported to me, to rub his nose in the hierarchy, to make him acknowledge daily that the nobody he'd dismissed had built something he now needed to pay his bills. But mostly I just felt tired of the anger and the resentment and the need to prove anything to a man who'd never given me credit anyway. And I realized that hiring Richard would bring all that toxicity into my company, would poison the culture I'd worked so hard to build, would turn every interaction into a battle for dominance that nobody would win. So I declined the application, sent it back to HR with a note saying we needed someone with more recent industry experience, someone who'd been active in the rapidly changing logistics landscape rather than retired from a traditional corporation, and I thought that was the end of it, thought I'd never have to deal with Richard professionally again. But then Patterson came to see me, closed my office door, and sat down with this serious expression, and he told me about Richard's situation, about the forced early retirement and the financial stress and the desperation behind the application. Patterson said he'd vouched for Richard, had assured him Translogix would be a good fit, and now he felt responsible for the rejection, felt like he'd let down a friend who needed help. He asked if I'd reconsider, if maybe we could find a role that wouldn't require regular interaction with me, something remote or project-based that would give Richard the income he needed without bringing him into the core company operations. I asked Patterson point blank if he knew about my history with Richard, if he understood why this was complicated beyond normal hiring decisions, and Patterson said he'd figured it out, had heard enough references over the years to connect the dots, and he got it, understood why I'd be reluctant. But he also said that Richard had changed, that the forced retirement had humbled him in ways his earlier success never did, that he was different now, less arrogant, more grateful for opportunities, and maybe this could be a chance for healing rather than continued conflict. I wasn't sure I believed that, wasn't convinced that 70-year-old men fundamentally changed their character, but Patterson was a valued executive and his judgment mattered, so I told him to restructure the offer, make it a 6-month consulting contract focused on legacy client relationship management, entirely remote work with minimal interaction required, and we'd see how it went. Richard accepted immediately, probably had no idea I'd personally approved it, probably thought it was just standard HR processes and his credentials speaking for themselves, and for the next 6 months he did solid work, provided insights and connections that benefited the company, fulfilled his contract terms without drama or complications. Patterson reported that Richard seemed grateful, seemed to understand he was being given an opportunity rather than claiming something he deserved, and when the 6 months ended, I extended it to a year, then another year, and eventually it just became an ongoing arrangement where Richard worked part-time consulting for Translogix and got paid well enough to supplement his inadequate Donovan Industries pension. But here's the thing. Here's what Richard never knew, and what made everything so complicated and painful and ultimately revealing. When Donovan Industries got acquired and gutted by that private equity firm, when all those executives, including Richard, got pushed into early retirement with reduced pensions, Translogix was one of several companies that bid to acquire Donovan's logistics division, the core business unit that Richard had helped build over his career. We won that bid, integrated their operations into ours, absorbed their client base and their intellectual property and their remaining employees, and part of that acquisition included assuming responsibility for certain pension obligations to retired executives who'd met specific service and performance criteria. Richard met those criteria, had been with Donovan Industries for 41 years and held senior vice president status at the time of his departure. And according to the acquisition terms, Translogix inherited the obligation to supplement his reduced pension up to the amount he would have received if he'd retired normally at 65. The lawyers structured it as a new pension rather than a transfer to avoid confusion, set it up through our standard benefit system, and started making those monthly payments of $3,200 to Richard Montgomery starting about 6 months after the consulting arrangement began, running parallel to his consulting income. 2 separate payment streams from the same company, from the same CEO he'd said would never amount to anything. And Richard never knew, never connected the dots, never realized that his pension and his consulting checks both came from me, from the son-in-law he'd dismissed as mediocre, from the nobody he'd said lacked ambition and intelligence. The consulting work eventually tapered off as Richard got older and his energy declined, but the pension continued, would continue until he died, a permanent reminder of everything he'd gotten wrong about me, about success, about the danger of judging people by their starting point rather than their trajectory. But that was just the beginning of understanding how deeply our lives had become intertwined, how the company I'd built in defiance of Richard's expectations had become the safety net that supported him in his vulnerability, how elder respect isn't about demanding acknowledgement, but about extending dignity even to those who withheld it from you. Sitting in my office that morning, staring at Richard's name on the pension list, I felt anger and satisfaction and sadness all swirling together in ways I couldn't separate into clean emotions. The anger was old, decades old, the accumulated weight of dismissals and contempt and predictions of my failure that I'd carried like stones in my pockets all these years. The satisfaction was newer, the warm feeling of vindication, of knowing I'd proven him wrong in the most definitive way possible, of knowing he was literally dependent on my success for his financial security, even if he didn't realize it. But the sadness was freshest, the recognition that this victory felt hollow, that proving yourself to someone who never believed in you doesn't actually heal anything, just confirms that the relationship was broken beyond repair and always had been. I called Margaret, something I rarely did during work hours, and I told her what I'd discovered, about the pension payments, about the whole complicated web of our professional connection, and she was quiet for a long time before saying anything. Then she said, "You've been paying my father's pension for 6 years and never told me." And I could hear both gratitude and hurt in her voice. Gratitude that I'd supported her father even when he didn't deserve it. Hurt that I'd kept this secret from her. Let her worry about her parents' finances when I knew they were being taken care of. I explained that I hadn't kept it secret to be deceptive. I'd just handled it as a business matter, one of hundreds of pension obligations the company had assumed through various acquisitions, and I honestly hadn't thought about the symbolic weight of it until seeing his name on that list this morning. Margaret asked what I was going to do, if I was going to tell her father, if I wanted some kind of acknowledgement or apology for all those years of disrespect, and I said I didn't know, hadn't gotten that far in my thinking, was still processing what it all meant. She said her father was 82 now, dealing with health issues, probably didn't have many years left, and maybe this was an opportunity for reconciliation, for healing old wounds, for ending the silent war that had poisoned family gatherings for decades. I told her I'd think about it, would figure out the right approach, but inside I was skeptical. Wasn't sure I wanted reconciliation with a man who'd never apologized for his contempt, never acknowledged he'd been wrong about me, never treated me with the respect I'd earned through decades of proving myself. But Margaret's words kept echoing in my head over the following days, the suggestion that maybe my father-in-law's age and vulnerability created an opening for something different, something that transcended the old pattern of judgment and defiance. I started thinking about Harold Morrison, the mentor who'd believed in me when Richard didn't, who'd taught me that true success includes generosity toward those who underestimated you, who'd said that bearing grudges is like drinking poison and hoping the other person dies. Harold had been gone 20 years, but his lessons remained, and I could almost hear him asking me what I wanted my legacy to be, whether I wanted to be remembered as the CEO who succeeded despite his father-in-law's contempt, or the man who extended grace even when it wasn't deserved. I decided to visit Richard, something I hadn't done voluntarily in probably 15 years, all our contact mediated through Margaret and family obligations. I called Eleanor and asked if I could stop by for coffee, didn't explain why, just said I wanted to talk to Richard about something, and she agreed with this surprise and caution in her voice, probably wondering what had prompted this unexpected outreach. I drove to their house, the same house where I'd had that first terrible dinner 45 years ago, though it looked smaller now, more worn, the white columns needing paint, and the landscaping less manicured than I remembered. Visual evidence that maintaining appearances gets harder when money gets tighter and age makes everything more difficult. Richard answered the door himself, moving slowly with a cane, looking older than his 82 years, and his face went through several expressions when he saw me. Surprise mostly, but also wariness, probably wondering if I was there to deliver bad news about Margaret or the kids. I told him I wanted to talk about some business matters, that it would take about half an hour if he had time, and he invited me in with this formal politeness that emphasized the distance between us, the decades of carefully maintained boundaries and mutual avoidance. Eleanor served coffee in the same china cups I remembered from that first dinner, and the three of us sat in their living room surrounded by photos of Margaret and the grandchildren. This shrine to family that somehow didn't include me, despite my 45 years of marriage to their daughter. I started by asking Richard about his consulting work for Translogics, whether he'd enjoyed it, whether he felt it had been valuable for both sides, and he warmed up slightly, talking about the projects he'd worked on and the relationships he'd maintained and how much he'd appreciated the opportunity when he'd needed it. He said Patterson had told him that I'd personally approved the contract extension, that I'd advocated for keeping him on when budget cuts might have eliminated consulting roles, and he wanted to thank me for that, for giving him work when he needed it, even though our personal history was complicated. The gratitude seemed genuine, awkward, but real, and I realized Patterson had been right, that Richard had changed, that losing his corporate identity and facing financial vulnerability had sanded down some of his arrogance, made him more capable of acknowledging dependence and appreciating help. Then I told him the rest, about the Donovan Industries acquisition, about Translogics assuming pension obligations for retired executives, about the $3,200 that had been deposited into his account every month for the past 6 years, money coming from my company, from the business I'd built while he predicted I'd fail. I watched his face as he processed this information, saw confusion give way to understanding, give way to something like shame. This recognition that the safety net supporting him in his retirement was woven from the success of the son-in-law he'd dismissed as inadequate. Eleanor gasped, covered her mouth with her hand, and I could see tears forming in her eyes. This overwhelming emotional response to the revelation that they'd been dependent on my generosity without knowing it, that their financial security was connected to the very person Richard had treated with contempt. Richard was silent for a long time, staring at his coffee cup like it held answers, and when he finally looked up at me, his eyes were red and his voice was rough with emotion. He said, "I was wrong about you, Samuel, wrong for 45 years, and I'm sorry, more sorry than I can express in words that make sense." He said he'd been arrogant and judgmental and cruel in ways he hadn't fully recognized until this moment, until understanding that I'd been supporting him financially while maintaining my dignity and not demanding acknowledgement or apology. He said his predictions about my failure had been projections of his own insecurities, his own fear that he wasn't actually as successful as his title suggested, that dismissing me had been a way of protecting himself from examining his own limitations. He talked about losing his job at Donovan, how devastating it had been to go from respected executive to early retiree, how he'd finally understood what it felt like to be judged as inadequate by people with power over your circumstances. He said that experience had given him perspective, had made him realize how he'd treated me, how he'd weaponized his position and connections to make me feel small, how he'd let his own status anxiety poison his relationship with his daughter's husband. He said he'd wanted to apologize for years, but hadn't known how, hadn't known if I'd even care to hear it, hadn't been sure he deserved forgiveness for decades of contempt and dismissal. Eleanor was crying openly now, adding her own apologies, saying she'd enabled Richard's behavior by staying silent, by not challenging his judgments, by letting social class prejudices override her recognition of my character and work ethic. She said she'd watched me be a good husband to Margaret and a good father to her grandchildren, had seen evidence over decades that Richard was wrong about me, but she'd never said anything because maintaining family peace seemed more important than standing up for truth. She said that was cowardice, that she regretted it, that she hoped I could forgive them both for failing to see what was obvious to everyone else, that I was exactly the kind of man any parent should be grateful to have their daughter marry. I sat there, Listening to these apologies, these confessions, these decades-late acknowledgments of everything I'd already known about how they'd treated me, and I felt relief more than vindication. Relief that the truth was finally spoken, that we could stop pretending our relationship was anything other than what it had been. Relief that maybe in whatever time Richard had left, we could find some kind of peace, if not actual warmth. I told them I accepted their apologies, that I understood how fear and prejudice could distort people's judgment, that I didn't want to spend my remaining years carrying resentment for things that couldn't be changed. I told them the pension would continue as long as Richard lived, that it was a contractual obligation, but also my choice to honor it fully, that I didn't expect gratitude or make it conditional on our personal relationship improving. But I also told them, and this was important, that respect is earned through how you treat people when they're vulnerable, when they can't fight back, when dismissing them costs you nothing. I said that they'd failed that test for decades, that their apologies now were valuable, but they couldn't erase the years when Margaret cried over her father's contempt for her husband, when family gatherings felt like hostile territory, when I'd had to prove myself over and over while they moved the goalposts and found new reasons to judge me inadequate. I said I was willing to move forward, to build whatever relationship was possible in the time we had left, but that moving forward required acknowledging the past honestly, without minimizing or excusing the damage that had been done. Richard nodded, said he understood, said he didn't expect me to forget or pretend it hadn't hurt, just hoped we could find some way to coexist peacefully, to make Margaret's life easier by ending the Cold War that had dominated family dynamics for so long. Eleanor asked if we could start over, build a relationship based on who we were now rather than who we'd been decades ago. And I told her honestly that I didn't think you could start over at our age, couldn't erase 45 years of history and pretend to be strangers meeting fresh, but we could build something new on top of the old foundation, acknowledge the cracks while trying to prevent them from spreading further. The conversation lasted 3 hours, moving from the formal living room to their kitchen table, where we drank more coffee and talked about Margaret and the grandchildren and the business, really talked for the first time in decades. And I left feeling lighter than I had in years, like I'd been carrying weight I didn't realize was there until it was gone. Driving home in my car, passing through the neighborhood where I'd first felt so judged and inadequate 45 years ago, I realized that proving Richard wrong had never been the real goal. Had just been the strategy I'd used to cope with his contempt, and what I'd actually wanted all along was simple recognition, basic respect, acknowledgement that I had value regardless of my pedigree or connections or starting circumstances. Margaret was waiting when I got home, had clearly been anxious about how the conversation would go, and when I told her about Richard's apology and our tentative reconciliation, she started crying. These relieved tears that she'd probably been holding back for decades, and she said this was an answer to prayers she'd stopped praying because they seemed impossible. I held her and promised we'd do our best, that I couldn't promise everything would be perfect, but I'd try to let go of the old anger, try to build whatever relationship was possible with her parents in their final years, try to model for our own children and grandchildren what grace looks like even when it's hard. The months that followed were strange, learning to interact with Richard and Eleanor without the weight of old resentments, trying to find conversational topics that didn't trigger defensive reactions or resurrect past conflicts. We started having regular dinners, rotating between their house and ours and Sarah's place, and these gatherings were awkward at first, but gradually became more natural, more relaxed, more like actual family instead of people fulfilling obligations. Richard asked me about Translogics, seemed genuinely interested in how the business operated and what challenges we faced, and I found myself sharing insights and stories I'd never thought he'd care about, never thought he'd respect enough to really hear. He told me about his years at Donovan Industries, about the politics and pressure and constant fear of obsolescence that came with corporate life, and I understood for the first time that his arrogance had been armor, protection against his own insecurities about whether he actually deserved his success or had just gotten lucky with timing and connections. We talked about class and prejudice and how the American dream is supposed to work, about how his generation had been taught that pedigree mattered and mine had been taught that merit mattered, and how reality was probably more complicated than either narrative acknowledged. We didn't agree on everything, but we learned to disagree respectfully, to acknowledge each other's perspectives without needing to convert or convince or win arguments. Eleanor started calling me Samuel instead of Sam, a small shift that somehow felt significant. This recognition that I wasn't the casual acquaintance or temporary fixture she thought I was when I first married Margaret, but a permanent part of her family who deserved formal respect. She told Margaret privately that she was proud of what I'd built, proud of how I'd supported her daughter through all the years when Richard had made things difficult, proud of the grandfather I'd become to her grandchildren. Those second-hand compliments meant more than they should have, proof that even at 68 I still carried some of that young man's need for parental approval, still wanted Margaret's parents to think I was good enough for their daughter, even though I'd long since proven I was. But little did any of us know that the real reckoning was still ahead, that Richard's health would force one final confrontation with legacy and regret, and the consequences of how we treat people. Richard had a stroke 8 months after our reconciliation conversation, not massive but significant enough to require hospitalization and rehabilitation, significant enough to make his mortality real in ways it hadn't been before. Margaret and I spent days at the hospital with Eleanor, managing medical decisions and coordinating with doctors, and trying to keep Eleanor calm while she faced the possibility of losing her husband of 58 years. Richard survived, came home with weakness on his left side and slurred speech that gradually improved but never completely resolved, and the stroke changed him in ways that went beyond physical impairment. He became reflective, almost philosophical, talking about his life and choices with an honesty that would have been impossible before the medical crisis forced him to confront his mortality. He told me one afternoon, while Margaret and Eleanor were out running errands, that his biggest regret was wasting 40 years being wrong about me, that if he could change anything about his life, it would be treating me with respect from the beginning, being the father-in-law I deserved instead of the obstacle I'd had to overcome. He said the stroke had clarified things, had made him realize that relationships matter more than reputations, that he'd spent decades optimizing for the wrong variables, chasing status and image when he should have been investing in connection and love. I told him I understood regret, that I had my own collection of choices I'd make differently if I could go back, that part of getting old is carrying the weight of your mistakes and hoping they at least taught you something valuable. I told him that his initial judgment of me, as painful as it had been, had probably made me more determined, more focused, more willing to work hard and persist because I had something to prove. I said I didn't know if I would have built Translogics without that chip on my shoulder, without the drive to show him and everyone else who doubted me that they'd underestimated my potential. And in that weird way, his contempt had been almost a gift, motivation disguised as discouragement. Richard started crying then. This old man with his weakened body and slurred speech, crying because he realized that even his cruelty had become part of my success story, that I'd taken his weapon and turned it into fuel, that his attempt to diminish me had somehow contributed to my growth. He said that was generous of me, reframing his failures as unintentional contributions, but that generosity didn't erase the damage, didn't change the fact that he'd hurt his daughter by rejecting her chosen partner, didn't undo the years of tension and pain he'd created through his arrogance and prejudice. I told him the truth, which was that forgiveness doesn't erase history, but it does release you from being trapped in it, that holding grudges is exhausting and eventually hurts you more than the person who wronged you, that at our age we couldn't afford to waste whatever time we had left on maintaining old battles that nobody wins. I told him I'd forgiven him, not because he deserved it or earned it, but because carrying resentment was poison, and I'd rather spend my final years at peace than proving points to people who'd already admitted they were wrong. We spent a lot of time together after that, me and Richard, more than Margaret had expected, more than I would have predicted before the stroke forced this crisis-driven intimacy. I'd visit him several afternoons a week, bring lunch or coffee, sit in his study, and talk about business and family and life. And gradually, I came to understand him in ways I never had before, to see past the arrogant executive facade to the insecure man underneath, the person who'd needed external validation because he lacked internal confidence, who'd judged others harshly because he judged himself even more harshly, who'd never felt like he truly deserved his success and constantly feared being exposed as a fraud. Richard told me about his own father, a factory worker who'd been disappointed that his son chose office work over trades, who'd said that pushing papers wasn't real work, that Richard was soft and privileged and didn't understand what actual labor felt like. He said that dismissal had driven his entire career, this need to prove his father wrong by climbing as high as possible in corporate America, by earning titles and respect and money that demonstrated his choices had been valid. But his father died before Richard made senior vice president, died still thinking his son was wasting his potential on meaningless corporate politics, and Richard had spent decades trying to prove himself to a man who was no longer alive to see it. The parallel was obvious. This generational pattern of sons trying to prove themselves to judgmental fathers, of ambition driven by inadequacy rather than genuine passion, of success that never quite filled the void created by withheld approval. I told Richard about my own father, a kind man but limited, who'd been proud of me but also slightly baffled by my corporate career, who'd worked construction his whole life and saw my office job as easier but less authentic, less honorable than building things with your hands. I said I'd spent years trying to honor his work ethic while pursuing a different path, trying to prove that ambition didn't mean abandoning your roots, that you could succeed without betraying the people who raised you. Richard said we were more alike than he'd admitted, both driven by fathers who didn't quite understand us, both trying to prove something to people who couldn't fully appreciate what we'd achieved, both dealing with the complicated legacy of class mobility and generational change. He said that recognizing me as a younger version of himself should have created connection rather than contempt, should have made him mentor me rather than dismiss me, but that self-awareness had come too late, after decades of damage that couldn't be undone. I told him it wasn't too late, that we still had whatever time remained, that reconciliation in your 80s was better than never reconciling at all, that our grandchildren were learning from watching us navigate this difficult rebuilding, learning that relationships could be repaired even after serious damage, learning that pride wasn't worth sacrificing family over. He seemed comforted by that, the idea that even his mistakes might teach useful lessons to the next generation, that his belated growth could model something valuable about humility and change. Then Richard did something unexpected, something that changed how I understood our whole complicated relationship. He asked if he could address the TransLogix management team, wanted to speak at one of our quarterly meetings, had something he needed to say publicly about me and the company and what he'd learned. I was hesitant, worried it would be awkward or that he'd somehow undermine his own apology by trying to make it a performance, but Margaret encouraged me to let him do it, said her father needed this, needed to make public amends for public contempt, needed to correct the record for people who'd heard him dismiss me over the years. So I arranged it, added Richard to the agenda for our next quarterly meeting, told the management team we had a special guest who wanted to address them briefly before we got into business matters. The meeting room filled with about 50 people, executives and managers, and key employees, and Richard arrived early with Eleanor and Margaret, moving slowly with his cane but dressed formally in a suit and tie, clearly treating this as an important occasion that required respect. When it was his turn to speak, I introduced him simply as Richard Montgomery, retired senior vice president from Donovan Industries and consultant for TransLogix, didn't mention our family connection because I wanted people to hear his words without that context coloring their interpretation. Richard stood at the front of the room, leaning on the podium for support, and he began by saying he wanted to tell them about a mistake he'd made 45 years ago, a judgment error that had persisted for decades and taught him important lessons about character and success and the danger of assumptions. He told them about meeting me when I was 23, how he'd dismissed me as unworthy of his daughter because I lacked pedigree and connections, how he'd predicted I'd never amount to anything significant, how he'd spent decades treating me with contempt disguised as concern. He told them about being wrong, spectacularly wrong, about watching me build TransLogix into one of the most respected logistics companies in the industry while he coasted on corporate titles and eventually got pushed out by people who valued cost-cutting over experience. He told them about discovering that his pension, the financial safety net supporting his retirement, was being paid by the company I'd built, by the son-in-law he'd said lacked ambition and intelligence. The room was silent, everyone processing this revelation, and I could see people making connections, realizing that Richard was my father-in-law, understanding the full weight of what he was confessing. Richard continued, said he was speaking publicly because his contempt had been public, because he'd told colleagues and friends that his daughter had married beneath her, because he'd used his social capital to dismiss me and now needed to use whatever capital remained to correct that record. He said that Samuel Peters, and here he gestured toward me, was exactly the kind of leader every company should want, someone who built success through integrity and persistence rather than connections and politics, someone who extended grace even to people who'd treated him with contempt, someone who valued relationships over revenge and character over ego. He said he was grateful to be receiving a pension from Translogics, grateful that I'd approved his consulting work when he needed it, grateful that I'd supported him financially while maintaining my dignity and not demanding acknowledgement or apology. He said that elder respect isn't automatic. It's earned through how you treat people throughout your life, and he'd failed that test for decades, failed to show respect to someone who'd earned it many times over. He said he hoped his mistake would teach them something valuable, that judging people by their starting circumstances rather than their character was the surest way to miss extraordinary talent, that the quiet person in the corner might be building something remarkable while flashier people just make noise. Richard sat down after that, visibly exhausted from the emotional and physical effort, and the room erupted in applause, not for him, but for the honesty, for the public amends, for the courage it took to confess failure so completely and specifically. Several people came up afterward to shake his hand, to thank him for sharing his experience, to tell him that admitting mistakes publicly was rare and valuable. Patterson hugged him, told him he was proud of his friend for having the courage to correct old wrongs, told him this kind of honesty was exactly what corporate America needed more of. But the most meaningful moment came when my CFO, Sandra, a woman who'd been with Translogics since the early days, who'd worked extra hours without complaint and believed in our mission when we were just a basement startup, came over to me and said quietly, "Your father-in-law just gave you the best endorsement possible, the kind that means more than any award or recognition, the admission from a former critic that they were wrong and you were right all along." She said that Richard's speech would become part of company lore, would be repeated to new employees as an example of our values and culture, would remind everyone that character matters more than credentials and persistence beats privilege. Margaret cried through the whole speech, these quiet tears that kept streaming down her face, and afterward she hugged her father for a long time, told him she was proud of him, told him this meant everything to her because it validated what she'd always known, that I was exactly who she thought I was when she chose to marry me against his advice. Eleanor cried too, told me she was sorry it had taken so long for them to see what was obvious, that she hoped the remaining years would be characterized by the respect and warmth they should have extended from the beginning. The weeks after Richard's speech felt lighter, like pressure had been released from our family system, like we could finally breathe without navigating around unspoken tensions and old resentments. Richard's health continued declining, the stroke having accelerated aging processes that were probably inevitable, but felt urgent and frightening to those of us watching him weaken. We knew he didn't have much time, months maybe, and that knowledge created this urgency around saying important things, making peace with whatever needed reconciling, ensuring that the end would be characterized by connection rather than regret. Richard started writing letters to the grandchildren, these long, reflective pieces about his life lessons and mistakes and hopes for them, and several of those letters mentioned me, specifically told his grandchildren to pay attention to their grandfather Samuel, to learn from how I'd built success through character rather than shortcuts, to notice how I treated people regardless of their status or position. He wrote that his biggest mistake had been judging me by conventional metrics of success rather than actually observing my behavior and values, and he hoped they'd learn from his error, would evaluate people based on who they were rather than what they appeared to be. One letter in particular, addressed to my oldest grandson Michael, talked about the pension, about discovering that his grandfather was being supported by the company I'd built. Richard wrote that this was both humiliating and illuminating, that it forced him to confront his own dependence on the very person he'd dismissed as inadequate, that it taught him more about grace and dignity than decades of corporate success ever had. He told Michael to remember that how you treat people when they're vulnerable reveals your true character, that extending support to those who've wronged you is harder than punishing them, but ultimately more satisfying, that forgiveness isn't weakness, it's strength that most people never develop. Richard died on a Tuesday morning in spring, peacefully in his sleep with Eleanor beside him, and we buried him the following Saturday in a cemetery with old oak trees and neat rows of headstones, the kind of place that feels both sad and peaceful. I gave a eulogy because Margaret asked me to, because she said I could speak to her father's complexity in ways others couldn't, because I represented both his greatest failure and his redemption, and I tried to honor that request honestly. I talked about Richard's intelligence and ambition, about his corporate success and his dedication to his family, about the lessons he'd taught through both his mistakes and his belated corrections. I talked about our difficult history without dwelling on the pain, acknowledged that he'd been wrong about me for decades, but had the courage to admit it and change, modeled for everyone watching. That growth is possible even late in life if you're willing to face uncomfortable truths. I talked about the pension, about the irony and the lesson embedded in that financial connection, about how Richard had ended up depending on the success of the person he'd predicted would fail, and how that dependence had ultimately taught him more about life than success ever did. I said that Richard's legacy wasn't his corporate title, or his executive compensation, or even his family. Though those things mattered, it was the lesson he'd taught through his evolution, that being wrong isn't permanent if you're willing to acknowledge it, that pride can be overcome if you're motivated by love, that the final chapters of your life can redeem earlier mistakes if you have the courage to admit them and the humility to make amends. I said I was grateful for the reconciliation we'd found, grateful that Margaret hadn't had to choose between her father and her husband in his final years, grateful that his grandchildren had seen their grandfather model growth and change rather than remaining trapped in stubbornness and defensiveness. The reception afterward was at Richard and Eleanor's house, and people told stories about Richard's life and career and family, and several colleagues from his Donovan Industries days mentioned that Richard had talked about me in recent months, had said I was a remarkable businessman and son-in-law, had expressed regret about not supporting me earlier, had used our story as an example of how corporate arrogance and class prejudice could blind you to talent and character. Those second-hand testimonials meant something, proof that Richard's public amends had been genuine rather than performative, that he'd actually changed his narrative about me, that the reconciliation had been real. Eleanor asked if I'd help her with Richard's financial affairs, said she didn't understand all the accounts and investments and pension arrangements, and I agreed because that's what family does. You show up when people need help regardless of history. Going through Richard's files, I found copies of the consulting contracts I'd approved, notes he'd written about TransLogic's projects, records of the pension payments he'd been receiving, and tucked into the pension folder was a handwritten note, clearly meant for me though it had never been delivered. The note said, "Samuel, if you're reading this then I'm gone, and you're helping Eleanor with my affairs, like the good man you are. I want you to know that discovering you were supporting me financially was the most important lesson of my life, more valuable than any success I achieved at Donovan, more meaningful than any title or recognition. You had every right to be petty, to reduce my pension to the minimum legal obligation, to make me feel the sting of dependence on someone I'd wronged, but you didn't. You maintained the full pension, honored your contractual obligations, treated me with dignity I hadn't earned.